The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 10. Poppy Man. Linus was led down to the dungeons, sobbing morosely all the way. Every now and then he was shoved in the back by Crusini, who was still grinning and chuckling about the commander's cruelty. It seemed to have made his day. For a time, Linus tried to keep track of which direction he faced, trying to keep his bearings, but there were few windows through which he saw anything he recognised, and it was difficult to see points of reference, as he could not spare more than a quick glimpse before being shoved along. They made their way below ground level, and the hallways became darker and were now made of rugged grey stone rather than the polished stone of the upper levels. The underbelly of the palace was all tunnels and dimly lit passages, which turned and twisted about. There was a dripping sound coming from somewhere, and the air became cool and moist. Their footfalls echoed all around. Linus wondered what the dungeons were going to be like, and as he did so, the dark side of his imagination seemed to go haywire. He imagined men hanging limply against stone walls, chained by the wrists, with rats gnawing at their toes. He imagined toothless old men so undernourished that they looked like skeletons. He heard in his mind a symphony of moaning and groaning from a dungeon full of people dying slow and agonizing deaths. And suddenly, as he tried to imagine what kind of people he would see down there, he was struck by a question which just about burst out of his mouth. It seemed like such an obvious question that he couldn't believe that he hadn't already asked it. He remembered the expectant look on the commander's face in the dining hall when he had asked if he had any more questions, and Linus knew now that this had been what the commander had in mind. Crusini, he said, suddenly finding his voice, was a man named Evander captured. Evander? Yes, Evander Diomede. The guard gave Linus an extra hard shove in the back and responded, I don't make a habit of becoming friendly with the criminals. He murdered my parents just 2 days ago. The guards have been looking for him. There was a search group. Have you seen him? Crusini slowed and seemed to be coming gradually to a realization. The Smith family, he said thoughtfully. You are the boy whose parents were murdered in the special residencies on rest day, aren't you? Yes, that's right, by a man named Evander. He was our servant. Do you know if... And that's how Deimos knew your name. Yes, we met just yesterday. Now answer me, do you know if Evander was caught or not? There was impatience in Linus's voice, and even as he spoke, he knew he had grown a little too daring. Crusini, suddenly realizing he had been disrespected by a prisoner, seized Linus by the throat and slammed him up against the stone wall. If you talk to me like that again, boy, you had better say something worthwhile, because they will be your last words. Linus tried to hide his terror, cocking his head in mock amusement, and for a moment he was gripped by an urge to spit right in Crusini's eyes. He didn't dare do it, but he might as well have, for the smile that crept up the corners of his mouth betrayed the same amount of nerve, and Crusini threw him to the ground by the neck. A sharp pain rang through his head and his vision went black. Your friend isn't here, said Crusini, just you. A whopping kick to the stomach robbed Linus of his breath. His face flushed, hot blood seemingly boiling in his temples, and tears of anger began to stream down his face. The fact that he had ended up here whilst the man who murdered his parents still roamed free was maddening. Crusini's laughs echoed all around the hall, bouncing off the stone walls and seemingly accumulating around Linus's ears. The sheer injustice of it all was too much to bear. Linus was dragged by the collar, kicking and screaming, to the end of the hall, where Crusini unlocked a heavy, iron-studded door. This one trespassed onto the palace gardens. Chain him up, he said to the dungeon keeper, an evil grin planted across his face. A wave of viciousness swept over Linus now. All hope of surviving was abandoned, seemingly replaced by sheer recklessness. He launched a wild attack on Crusini, delivering a fist to his eye, and made a grab at his short sword, which was still tucked into Crusini's belt. But he was thwarted by a heavy blow to the back of his head, sending him to the floor, followed by a a beating of every inch of his body by both Crusini and the keeper. The next thing he knew, Linus was lying on a cold stone floor, tethered to the ground by a chain shackled to his ankle. He sat up and peered around the dark dungeon, his sight blurred. He could see just one other prisoner lying on his back rather casually, his knees resting against another wall, and his ankle chained to the same spot as Linus. The keeper was nowhere to be seen, nor was Crusini. "Welcome back, son," said the man. There was nothing welcoming in his tone. He spoke in a coarse whisper. Linus didn't respond, but merely grunted and put his palm to his throbbing forehead. He was becoming increasingly aware of the foul stench that seemed to linger through the air. "They sure did a number on you. You give 'em some cheek?" "Tried to fight 'em," grunted Linus. "Unwise, my friend. No point in struggling." Guess not," replied Linus. "No point in struggling," repeated the man. "Yeah," Linus agreed. Linus lowered himself back to the ground and rested his head gingerly against the soothing coldness of the stone floor. "No point in struggling." Linus saw that the man was twitching a little now, his leg jerking at the knee. "No point in struggling," he said once again, but now he seemed to be talking to himself rather than Linus. Linus drifted in and out of consciousness for several hours, stirring occasionally to see the man still twitching and muttering to himself. As the hours dashed by, the muttering became a whimpering, and then a sobbing, and then it became silence, and eventually Linus awoke completely to find the man asleep. He was a young-looking man, but with a thick beard and matted hair. He had a face that looked as if it might have once been handsome, but had grown gaunt with stress and exhaustion and malnutrition. For several more hours, Linus sat glumly in the dungeon, weeping periodically and at times considering waking up the man for company, but never actually doing so. He was startled occasionally by the man's sudden yelps and gasps and murmurs, and all but knew what the man was dreaming about. Linus had tried to fall back asleep but could not. Sleep had been comforting, an escape from this twisted and dark version of reality which was now his own, and a route back to the more familiar. But alas, he could not quite get there. He was too awake now, and his body had begun to ache all over, the pains from his beatings now entirely present. As the time slid by, utterly immeasurable to Linus, for the dungeon showed no signs of day or night, he tried to comprehend what he now knew was his fate, facing a war elephant for a full 5 minutes. But it seemed so surreal and extreme that it proved incomprehensible. His mind now flickered persistently with thoughts and questions which seemed impossible to stem. He tried to imagine the trial in his head, and when he did so, fear swelled in him, panic bubbled up his throat, and his heart seemed to throb rather than beat. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like he was living his own life anymore, because breaking into palace gardens and being beaten by guards, being imprisoned in dungeons and fighting elephants were all things which simply didn't happen in the life of the Linus Smith he thought that he knew. For a very long time, maybe several hours, Linus stared at the face of the man on the ground, willing him to wake up so that he could have somebody to talk with. His features were sunken and bleak and his skin grimy. Drool trickled down his cheek onto the stone floor, and even as he slept, he still twitched about. Eventually the man woke. He sat upright, leaning against the wall, shivering. "My name is Linus. What's yours?" "It's..." For a few seconds the man looked as if he might have forgotten his name. Then he continued rather dreamily. "It's Flower." "Flower?" repeated Linus, who was certain that this was not really the man's name. "Yes, it's Flower. Flower like a bard. Flower like a gift from God. Flower in a field like..." "It's nice to meet you, Flower," interrupted Linus. Linus wondered how long Flower had been imprisoned here, and he asked the question. "How long have you been down here, Flower?" "Well, it's difficult to say, isn't it, Liner? Day and night don't exist down here, but if I were to guess, I'd estimate 3 days. 3 days, exclaimed Linus, who was certain that Flower had surely meant to say years or decades. "Yes, I think so. I was arrested on rest day during the ceremony. They accused me of stealing from Valento's cellar, but I didn't, I swear." The thought of wine made Linus feel weary and ill almost instantly. He swallowed hard and tried to put it out of his mind. He had also now come to the conclusion that Flower must have already been insane before he was a prisoner. Valento himself gave me that bottle, he continued. He gave it to you? Yummy, snapped Flower. Yummy wine, very yummy. Surely Valento's finest. Gave it to me. Just gave it to me on the street. Told me it was because the bottle was tarnished and he couldn't sell it to the palace. But it was a setup. Guards seized me and Valento accused me of stealing the bottle from the cellar, which hurt my eyes because I thought he was my friend. Ha! Thought I'd made a friend. He burst into hearty laughter for a solid minute, which Linus could not interrupt, for it boomed so very loudly. But as suddenly as it had started, it halted and Flower began to talk again. I tried to speak out, but they wouldn't hear a word of it. Next thing I know, I'm here in the dungeons awaiting trial, awaiting thump. He had screamed the last word. Thump, he squealed, with a savage glare at Linus. Thump, 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 and I'm gone. Gone, gone, he said whimsically, and then he slumped lower and began to giggle insanely. Flower, listen, calm down, my friend, it's all right. You're safe here now, Linus assured him, desperately trying to pacify Flower and bring him back from his burst of insanity. But the giggling didn't stop. It grew shrill and increasingly hysterical. For now, he wailed. Flower, stop. But he would not. He was rousing into a tumultuous crescendo of hysteria. Safe for now. Flower? Linus couldn't bear it. The man's fit seemed to be penetrating into Linus's mind, making him feel panicked and short of breath. Flower, stop! The laughter grew and grew, becoming more and more penetrating, trilling to new highs, until Linus could take it no more. He stood and pounced onto the man and had delivered several hard strikes to his face before the laughter stemmed. Flower began to sob quietly, and Linus instantly felt regret. Flower, he said softly, I'm sorry, It's okay, Lina, he muttered, seemingly relieved of his insanity. I understand, I'm sorry too. It's bad enough you've wound up down here. You don't need a crazy man making life even harder. I'm just scared that if you go crazy, it's going to rub off onto me, said Linus with a grim smile. For a while after that, Flower became quite settled and nearly seemed normal to Linus. They discussed that it had been early morning when Linus was caught, and from that they tried to work out the time of day. But it was not much good, for they had both slept and neither of them was sure for how long, and even in the periods outside of sleep, time seemed skewed and incalculable. They came to the conclusion that it was nearly a full day since Linus was captured, and it was probably somewhere between midnight and mid-morning of the next day. But it really was impossible to know, as some minutes had seemed like hours and some hours like seconds. It was about another full day before anything happened. The door, which was far beyond their reach and sectioned off by thick iron bars for good measure, had opened, dusty light spilling over them. The single lamp which burned beside the door had died hours before, leaving them in near complete blackness. Through the door came a guard carrying a lamp, 2 cups and a ceramic bottle. What day is it, and what hour? Asked Flower, but the guard did not speak. He exchanged the lamp on the wall and set the bottle and cups on the ground inside the bars, sliding them forward with the blade of his sword so that they were within reach for Linus and Flower. The guard left the dungeon, taking the dead lamp with him and locking the door behind him. The cups contained some lumpy goo, which looked entirely unappetizing. Flower gulped his down hungrily and Linus followed suit. It tasted like pure starch with maybe some ground barley, bearable and not at all as bad as it had looked. Flower grabbed the ceramic bottle and filled his cup with water, swirling it around to dislodge the leftover goo he couldn't get into his mouth, and downed it in a single gulp. He handed it to Linus, who did the same. Apart from 3 more visits from the guard, nothing much more happened for what seemed like a week. Both men knew that on rest day they would face death, but it is impossible to know when rest day was. It felt as if it had surely been longer than a week by now. Linus had managed to sleep quite a bit, and so did Flower, who still twitched nervously throughout. Flower had had a few more bursts of insanity, which Linus had controlled by slapping him about the face, but they seemed to be lessening in severity. His hysterics became less frenzied, but somehow more insane. He would sit, chuckling to himself for hours, and eventually Linus learnt to block out the chuckling. Linus also noticed that Flower's eyes had begun to deaden. slowly becoming dull, and wondered if a person could ever recover after losing himself so thoroughly. The weight was killing them both. Something needed to happen. But then, quite suddenly, something did happen. It started with muffled yelling, coming from outside the door. The doors burst open, and a man was forced through, thrashing about wildly, held in an arm lock by a guard. A second prisoner was pushed through, this one wearing nothing but his undergarments. "We better keep them apart," said one guard to the other. "They'll surely have each other, if we don't separate them." "My son," bellowed the first man. "He killed my son." "All right, enough," yelled a guard. The bars were unlocked and slid aside, and the first prisoner was taken to the far wall of the dungeon, which he was chained to by one of his wrists. The man in his underwear, who had not yet spoken and wore on his face a look of pure fury, was chained to the iron bars at the entry to the dungeon. The guards left. "I'll kill you, Churned. You hear me?" screamed the man against the far wall. His face was twisted and red with rage, and he spat as he spoke. But the other man, Churned, merely laughed quietly and said in a dark undertone, "We are already dead, you foolish man." The man continued to yell and scream threats of death at the other, breaking into tears occasionally and at other times thrashing hard against his restraints. Eventually he stopped yelling and sunk to the ground and began to howl in tears. Flower joined him, and the pair howled together for a while until Linus could bear it no more. He administered to Flower his usual treatment, a fast slap across the face, and moved forth to sit in front of the blubbering man. At a closer look, Linus thought that the man seemed vaguely familiar. "What's your name, sir?" he asked, delicately. "Wesley," he replied. "Wesley Botsfield." Linus gasped in recognition. He indeed recognised the man's red hair and freckled round face. "Botsfield, I know you. I know your family. I'm friends with your son Jeremy. I know who—" But he trailed off, another realisation dawning on him. He stared at Wesley for confirmation. "He is my son," he said, tears welling. "And he is dead now. That man over there murdered him," he said, a fresh burst of fury brewing behind his livid eyes and pushing the tears over the threshold to trickle down his cheeks afresh. When Linus told him his name, Wesley knew it. Jeremy had spoken of him before. This seemed to soothe Wesley a little, and once he became settled enough, he began to tell Linus the story of his son's death, which was as follows. Weeks before the event, Wesley had begun to secretly experiment with the latex of the poppy pod that his family harvested. This had been strictly forbidden by the palace, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. Through his experiments, he found that boiling and ingesting it induced a feeling of pure bliss. A bliss that assured him that this was surely a magical substance, sent by the gods as a gift to mankind. A bliss that swiftly erased his ability to feel fear or pain or sorrow. Linus saw that there was longing in his eyes as he spoke of it. The guards became suspicious of his experiments and raided his home, finding the bottles of opium-infused wine he had made for his own private use. When a legion was sent to arrest him, his son Jeremy, but a child, had tried to stop the guards from taking his father, running after them with his wooden dagger, and his throat was slit by Churned, the very guard that sat opposite them in the dungeon. Commander Deimos had granted Wesley trial, but the guard had been stripped of his uniform and sentenced to a straight execution for the murder of an innocent. Linus was tempted to attack the guard, who sat and chuckled to himself throughout the entire story, but did not. His body still ached from his beatings, and the guard was a very large man, who was surely well trained and could defend himself. This, coupled with the knowledge that soon enough the guard would be killed by the stomp of an elephant's foot upon his head, was enough to pacify Linus sufficiently to leave the man be. "Excuse me for asking," said Linus, wiping a tear from his own eye, "but what day is it?" The question had been on the forefront of his mind since the door had burst open. "It is the week's end tomorrow. Tomorrow is rest day," said the man gravely. "Tomorrow?" repeated Linus, a wave of nausea sweeping through his body. Flower began to chuckle insanely. "I'm afraid so," replied Wesley. "I'm afraid so," laughed Flower. "So afraid, so afraid."